1,000 years stretched across medieval Europe, a continent both familiar and alien, where towering castles dotted the misty landscapes and kingdoms rose and fell with startling rapidity. Life was a constant negotiation between survival and ambition. For peasants, the rhythm of planting and harvest was punctuated by the distant roar of invading armies, while kings and lords maneuvered for power, wealth, and influence. It was a world where the line between triumph and tragedy could be measured in a single battle or a sudden plague. In the early centuries after Rome's collapse, Europe was a patchwork of fragile kingdoms and scattered communities, where local lords held sway over loyal peasants, and distant kings were more myth than ruler. Yet even in this apparent fragility, seeds of innovation and cultural growth were being sown. Monasteries preserved knowledge, trade slowly revived, and chivalric ideals began to take shape. Contrast this with the later medieval centuries, where burgeoning cities, mercenary armies, and devastating epidemics reshaped the social and political landscape. The familiar rhythm of rural life collided with sudden, unpredictable chaos. But what truly defined this era was not only the grand sweep of kings and conquests, but the intimate human dramas playing out in towns and villages. Families lived in constant tension between hope and fear, their fortunes rising and falling with events far beyond their control. Plagues could wipe out a generation, yet in their wake, survivors found opportunity to reshape society. Wars could decimate armies, yet also elevate clever rulers and ambitious nobles. Power, survival, and ingenuity intertwined in ways that still echo through history. This narrative will trace the 1,000-year journey of medieval Europe, from the fragile beginnings after Rome's fall to the dynamic transformations of the late Middle Ages. It will explore the rise and fall of kingdoms, the relentless march of disease, the innovation sparked by conflict, and the human resilience that endured against all odds. The story of medieval Europe is not one of monotony or darkness, but of dramatic contrasts. Between order and chaos, poverty and opulence, ignorance and knowledge. By understanding these forces, we glimpse how the continent evolved, setting the stage for the Renaissance and the modern world. In the next chapters, we will witness kings and crusaders, peasants and scholars, plagues and battles, all threads in the vast, intricate tapestry of 1,000 years. And as we journey through these centuries, one question lingers. How did Europe survive, adapt, and ultimately transform itself amid such relentless trials? The rise of kingdoms and feudal Europe. After the last vestiges of the Western Roman Empire crumbled in 476 CE, Europe found itself in a precarious balance between chaos and opportunity. Vast territories that had once been bound together under Roman law and governance splintered into a patchwork of kingdoms, each ruled by ambitious warlords, tribal chieftains, or emerging dynasties. With Rome's sophisticated infrastructure gone, trade routes fragmented, cities shrank, and literacy declined. Yet in this apparent collapse lay the seeds of a new order. From the ashes of empire arose the structures that would define medieval Europe for centuries. In the north, the Germanic tribes carved out their own territories, blending Roman administrative practices with tribal customs. The Franks, under the leadership of Clovis in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, became the dominant force in what is now modern France. Clovis's conversion to Christianity was not merely spiritual. It was political, forging alliances with the powerful Roman Church and legitimizing his rule over a diverse population. Here we see a defining tension of the medieval period. The delicate dance between kings seeking centralized authority and a church intent on guiding the moral and spiritual compass of society. Further east, the remnants of Roman infrastructure were pressed into service by local lords, each commanding armies, levying taxes, and adjudicating justice within their domains. These lords formed the backbone of the feudal system, a hierarchy in which land was exchanged for loyalty and military service. Yet beneath this system's rigid hierarchy lay insecurity. Peasants, the majority of the population, labored under harsh conditions, bound to the land, subject to heavy taxation, and at the mercy of both local warlords and invading forces. Life was uncertain, and survival required constant vigilance, resilience, and often submission to powers far beyond one's control. Into this volatile landscape emerged Charlemagne, perhaps the single most iconic figure of early medieval Europe. Crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in 800 CE, Charlemagne sought to unify disparate territories under a centralized rule. His military campaigns stretched from modern-day France into Germany, Italy, and beyond. But even Charlemagne's grand vision faced the same inherent tension of his age, the limits of authority. While he could command armies and impose legal reforms, much of his empire depended on the loyalty of local counts and dukes, whose interests often diverged from imperial edicts. Along the coasts and rivers, a different kind of threat stirred: the Vikings. These seafaring raiders from Scandinavia exploited the fragmented political landscape, launching sudden, devastating attacks on monasteries, towns, and coastal settlements. Their longships could traverse rivers deep into the heart of kingdoms, and their raids instilled fear across Europe. Yet even the Vikings contributed to the transformation of Europe. Through settlement, trade, and cultural exchange, they reshaped territories, established new political centers, and accelerated the integration of formerly isolated regions into broader networks. Amid these grand narratives of kings, emperors, and raiders, ordinary people navigated a precarious existence. Peasants endured the constant pressure of taxation, corvée labor, and the threat of conscription. Seasons of poor harvest could trigger famine, leaving villages vulnerable to both starvation and disease. Yet this very struggle shaped societal structures. Peasant revolts, although rare, demonstrated the limits of feudal control, while the church's provision of sanctuary and charity reinforced its central role in daily life. The interplay between oppression and agency, between survival and aspiration, defined the human experience of early medieval Europe. The spread of Christianity was another transformative force. Missionaries traveled into pagan territories, converting kings and commoners alike. The church's influence extended far beyond spiritual guidance. It became a repository of knowledge, a legal authority, and a political actor. This created frequent tensions with secular rulers, who sought to assert dominion over their domains while navigating the moral and political imperatives imposed by religious institutions. Yet these tensions also fostered stability, providing a shared moral framework and a unifying cultural identity that cut across fractured political boundaries. As kingdoms stabilized and feudal hierarchies solidified, Europe witnessed the gradual emergence of regional identities. Alliances were forged through marriage, diplomacy, and military pacts, while the constant threat of invasion from Vikings, Magyars, and later Saracens reinforced the necessity of local defense and the reliance on fortified castles and towns. Trade, once diminished, began to revive in the wake of these relative stabilizations, linking previously isolated communities through markets, fairs, and riverine networks. Economic vitality, however uneven, created opportunities for new social classes, challenging traditional hierarchies and planting the seeds for later medieval transformations. The interplay of these forces, ambitious rulers, independent lords, resilient peasants, marauding raiders, and a dominant church, set the stage for the defining dynamics of medieval Europe. Authority was never absolute. Loyalty was negotiable. Survival was precarious. The period following Rome's fall was not mere darkness, as it is often portrayed, but a crucible in which the foundations of European civilization were forged. In this era of conflict negotiation and adaptation, Europe's political, social, and religious structures coalesced into a system that, despite its fragility, would endure for centuries. By the end of this section, we see a Europe in flux, kingdoms rising, feudal structures solidifying, and a continent slowly knitting itself together through both conflict and cooperation. The narrative of medieval Europe is one of contrasts, between central authority and local autonomy, peace and warfare, despair and resilience. These formative centuries shaped not only the rulers and elites, but also the lives of ordinary people, whose labor, faith, and endurance underpin the entire system. Understanding this period provides the lens through which we can appreciate the sweeping transformations, triumphs, and tragedies that define the medieval world. Crusades, conquests, and court intrigue. By the late 11th century, Europe had transformed from a patchwork of feudal holdings into a continent brimming with ambition, wealth, and tension. The earlier centuries of consolidation had given rise to powerful monarchies, each eager to extend influence beyond local borders. It was in this crucible of ambition and faith that the Crusades were born, a series of campaigns that would reshape Europe and the Near East alike. Pope Urban II's call to arms at Clermont in 1095 promised salvation to knights and nobles willing to take up the cross, transforming religious zeal into political and territorial conquest. Here, faith became a sword, and devotion to God intertwined with a hunger for land, power, and prestige. The Crusades were a theatre of contrasts. Knights draped in shining armor rode into the Holy Land with visions of honor and divine purpose. Yet they were confronted by the brutal realities of war. Sieges decimated cities, famine stalked armies, and disease claimed as many lives as combat. European monarchs, from Richard the Lionheart to Baldwin of Jerusalem, navigated both battlefield strategy and courtly intrigue, where alliances were as fragile as the lines of defense. Ambition, personal rivalries, and political maneuvering often overshadowed religious ideals, creating a tension between chivalric expectations and human fallibility. In Europe itself, the Crusades intensified power struggles among monarchs. England, under Henry II and later Richard, witnessed the consolidation of royal authority, even as internal rebellions and familial betrayals threatened stability. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the era's most remarkable figures, exemplified the intertwined nature of political ambition and personal influence. Her marriages to Louis VII of France and then Henry II of England positioned her as a pivotal player in dynastic conflicts that would shape centuries of European politics. Behind the grand narratives of kings and knights, Europe was a chessboard of intrigue, where loyalty was fleeting and cunning often outweighed valor. The consequences of these conflicts rippled far beyond the battlefield. Trade networks expanded as crusaders and merchants traversed the Mediterranean, bringing back not only goods but knowledge, ideas, and cultural practices. Spices, textiles, and architectural innovations flowed into European markets, accelerating the growth of cities and the emergence of a merchant class. Yet these exchanges were double-edged. Wealth concentrated among the elite, while peasants and common soldiers bore the human cost of taxation, conscription, and the disruption of local economies. The ideals of knighthood and religious devotion often masked the reality of exploitation, highlighting the enduring contrast between aspiration and suffering. Territorial conquest extended beyond the Holy Land. European powers frequently clashed over borders in France, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula. The Reconquista in Spain illustrated the long-term interplay of religion and politics, where Christian kingdoms gradually reclaimed territory from Muslim rulers. Castles and fortified towns proliferated as monarchs sought to project authority and defend newly acquired lands. Feudal lords negotiated, rebelled, and switched allegiances, testing the limits of central authority. This constant flux created a Europe simultaneously expanding in influence, yet racked by instability, where victory and devastation coexisted side by side. Courts became arenas of both diplomacy and subterfuge. Marriages sealed alliances, yet rivalries often turned to betrayal. Monarchs employed spies, negotiated secret treaties, and manipulated vassals to achieve strategic advantage. In England, the tension between royal power and baronial rights foreshadowed later constitutional struggles. while in France, Capuchin kings carefully cultivated loyalty through patronage and land grants. Nobles, clergy, and merchants navigated a web of obligations, loyalties, and ambitions, illustrating how political cunning was as essential as military prowess in shaping the medieval world. The Crusades also amplified the contrast between ideals and reality. Chivalric codes extolled honor, mercy, and loyalty, yet massacres, forced conversions, and looting were commonplace. European knights often faced moral dilemmas where duty to the crown, obedience to the church, and personal survival conflicted. These contradictions created a complex social landscape. The glorification of heroism coexisted with the horrors of war, reinforcing the duality that defined much of medieval society. Cultural exchange transformed Europe in subtle yet profound ways. Knowledge of mathematics, medicine, and astronomy from the Islamic world enriched European scholarship. Architectural innovations, including pointed arches and fortified city designs, spread northward, influencing Gothic cathedrals and castles. Even cuisine and fashion evolved, reflecting the movement of goods and ideas across borders. The Crusades, while rooted in conflict, became a conduit for European growth, linking the continent to wider Mediterranean networks and accelerating its transition toward urbanization and economic diversification. By the end of this period, Europe had been reshaped politically, socially, and culturally. Monarchs had solidified their influence, yet the constant negotiation between local lords, the church, and external threats ensured that power remained fluid. The lives of ordinary people continued to be defined by labor, tribute, and vulnerability, even as new economic opportunities arose. Crusades and conquests, courtly maneuvering, and emerging trade networks collectively crafted a Europe that was ambitious, interconnected, and perpetually on the edge of both triumph and catastrophe. In these centuries, ambition and faith collided in ways that defined the medieval world. Heroes like Richard the Lionheart and influential figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine left legacies intertwined with conquest and intrigue. Yet it was the countless untold stories of soldiers, peasants, and clergy that gave texture to this turbulent age. Europe was simultaneously expanding its horizons and testing the resilience of its social and political structures. It was an era of contrasts, glory shadowed by loss, devotion shadowed by ambition, and the promise of new horizons shadowed by the relentless reality of human frailty. Plagues, peasant revolts, and the decline of feudalism. By the 14th century, medieval Europe faced a convergence of crises that would shake the very foundations of its social, economic, and political structures. The once stable rhythms of feudal life were disrupted by a perfect storm of famine, war, and disease. Europe's population had been steadily growing, stretching the limits of available farmland. Harvests failed, grain prices soared, and malnutrition became widespread. Villages and towns that had seemed secure for generations now faced insecurity on multiple fronts. Amid this mounting pressure, a catastrophe of unprecedented scale appeared on the horizon: the Black Death. First arriving in Europe around 1347, the Black Death was a plague that did not discriminate. It tore through crowded cities and isolated hamlets alike, killing an estimated 1/3 of the continent's population within just a few years. Entire communities vanished. Families were reduced to solitary survivors. Laborers who remained alive found themselves in a dramatically altered world. This horror laid bare the fragility of life under feudalism. Lords, once secure in their control over their serfs and estates, faced deserted fields and empty tax registers. Meanwhile, the church struggled to provide guidance and solace in the face of overwhelming death. Its spiritual authority tested as prayers seemed to go unanswered. Yet within the devastation lay an unexpected opportunity. The sudden scarcity of labor shifted the balance of power, granting peasants and artisans newfound leverage. Wages rose, mobility increased, and some serfs even managed to buy their freedom. The rigid hierarchies that had defined medieval society for centuries were beginning to show cracks. Lords who had relied on predictable labor flows now faced rebellions and demands for reform. The contrast between mass death and individual opportunity created a tension that would fundamentally transform European life. Despair and hope coexisted, often in the same village square. Peasant revolts became increasingly common as frustrations boiled over. The Jacquerie in France in 1358 saw thousands of peasants rise against oppressive taxation and the burdens imposed by a feudal system unable to adapt to post-plague realities. Across England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 erupted in response to poll taxes and harsh labour regulations. While these uprisings were brutally suppressed, they demonstrated the vulnerability of the feudal order. They also signalled a profound shift. Peasants were no longer passive subjects but active participants in shaping their destinies. The fearsome authority of lords was not absolute, and this newfound assertiveness would echo in later centuries of European history. War compounded the suffering. The 100 Years' War between England and France, already underway, devastated the countryside, displacing populations and destroying crops. Castles and towns became fortresses under siege, and armies pillaged indiscriminately. While monarchs fought for dynastic claims and national prestige, ordinary people bore the consequences of scorched earth and economic disruption. Contrast emerges sharply here. Kings and nobles secured power and glory at immense human cost, while commoners struggled to survive, adapting to a reality where loyalty and service were as dangerous as rebellion. Disease. Famine and conflict collectively destabilized Europe's economy. Agricultural production declined sharply, and trade routes were disrupted. However, urban centers began to grow as survivors migrated in search of work and opportunity. Markets revived, artisans found new demand for their skills, and commercial activity slowly expanded. The rise of towns and a more dynamic economy challenged the feudal model, creating opportunities for social mobility that had been unimaginable in previous centuries. The tension between traditional hierarchies and emerging social structures defined the late medieval period and laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. The Church faced its own crises during this time. The plague's indiscriminate death toll shook faith and credibility, while corruption and political disputes further eroded confidence in clerical authority. Simultaneously, new religious movements and calls for reform emerged, reflecting a desire for spiritual and societal renewal. Cathedrals and monasteries continued to be built, yet the symbolic weight of religious authority was now tempered by the stark realities of human suffering. Faith and reason, hope and despair, became intertwined in the minds of Europeans struggling to understand their altered world. Through all this, cultural and intellectual life persisted, even flourished in unexpected ways. Universities, often located in plague-resistant cities, became centers of scholarship. Literature and art began to reflect both the trauma and resilience of society, grappling with themes of mortality, justice, and human agency. The late medieval period was thus a paradox: devastation and renewal, rigidity and flexibility, despair and opportunity existed side by side. Human ingenuity, courage, and adaptability became essential for survival. By the end of this turbulent era, the feudal system, once the unchallenged framework of European life, had begun to crumble. Lords no longer held uncontested authority. Peasants found leverage in labor scarcity, and emerging urban centers created alternative paths to wealth and influence. Warfare, disease, and famine had accelerated social, economic, and political transformation. These centuries of catastrophe set the stage for the cultural and intellectual flowering of the Renaissance, illustrating how human society could adapt, survive, and even thrive amid profound adversity. In examining this period, we witness the stark contrast of medieval life, death and opportunity, oppression and rebellion, chaos and innovation. The story of plagues, revolts, and the decline of feudalism is a testament to human resilience and the inexorable forces of change. It reminds us that history is rarely linear, It is shaped by crises, choices, and the relentless interplay between human ambition and the forces beyond human control. Medieval Europe was reborn from its own calamities, forging a path toward a new world of possibilities. Kings, wars, and the birth of nation-states. As the 15th century dawned, Europe stood at a crossroads. The centuries of feudal fragmentation, peasant revolts, and plagues had weakened the traditional structures that had governed the continent for so long. In their place, the seeds of centralized monarchies began to sprout, nurtured by the ambitions of kings, the pressures of war, and the desire for stability. Lords who had once wielded near absolute control over their fiefs found themselves negotiating with monarchs who sought to consolidate power, creating a tension that would define the emergence of the nation-state. Central to this transformation was the 100 Years' War, a prolonged and bitter conflict between England and France that spanned from 1337 to 1453. Though technically begun in the previous century, its political and cultural impact extended well into the late medieval period. Edward III of England claimed the French throne through a tenuous dynastic argument, sparking a series of campaigns that would devastate towns, fields, and populations across both kingdoms. Battles such as Crécy and Poitiers showcased not only the brutality of medieval warfare, but also the evolution of military tactics, with the English longbow emerging as a decisive weapon that could pierce armor and disrupt traditional cavalry dominance. Yet war was more than strategy. It was theater for human drama. Nobles and commanders navigated shifting alliances, betrayals, and personal rivalries, while ordinary people bore the consequences. Villagers were conscripted, taxed, or forced to provide supplies, their loyalty a fragile commodity under the strain of repeated invasions. Meanwhile, kings cultivated loyalty through rewards, land grants, and promises of protection, subtly undermining the autonomy of feudal lords. The balance of power was gradually tipping toward the crown, as centralized authority became both a military necessity and a political advantage. France, under rulers like Philip IV, exemplified this trend towards centralization. Philip, known as Philip the Fair, sought to strengthen royal authority by challenging the autonomy of nobles and asserting dominance over the clergy. His conflicts with the papacy, most famously with Pope Boniface V, highlighted the delicate interplay between secular and spiritual power. By subordinating powerful institutions to the authority of the crown, Philip laid the groundwork for a more cohesive state, one in which the king's word carried weight across a fragmented land. In contrast, England experienced similar struggles, where the crown balanced the ambitions of barons, the church, and emergent urban centers seeking economic influence. National identity began to emerge amid these conflicts. Whereas previous centuries had been defined largely by local loyalties and feudal obligations, the prolonged wars fostered a sense of belonging to larger political entities. French and English subjects, despite the suffering and devastation wrought by the 100 Years' War, increasingly conceived of themselves as part of a broader kingdom rather than merely a lord's vassalage. Symbols, ceremonies, and cultural narratives, stories of heroism, martyrdom, and resistance reinforce this nascent national consciousness. Joan of Arc, in particular, would come to embody this shift, her leadership and martyrdom inspiring a sense of French unity that transcended local feudal loyalties. Military innovations accelerated the decline of feudal power. The introduction of gunpowder, cannons, and improved fortifications gradually undermined the dominance of heavily armored knights. Castles, once impregnable, could now be breached with artillery, while professional armies composed of infantry, archers, and mercenaries reduced reliance on feudal levies. Monarchs invested in standing armies, paying soldiers directly, and centralizing military command. This shift not only altered the conduct of war, but also strengthened the hand of kings over their nobles, whose private armies were increasingly less decisive in large-scale conflicts. Diplomacy and political maneuvering were equally decisive. Marriages, treaties, and secret alliances allowed monarchs to expand influence without immediate bloodshed. Yet betrayal was always a possibility. Vassals might defect, neighboring states might exploit weakness, and internal factions could undermine authority. The human drama of loyalty and ambition permeated courts, where clever rulers navigated these risks to consolidate power. The intricate dance of diplomacy complemented battlefield strategy, illustrating that the formation of nation-states was as much a product of cunning and negotiation as of military conquest. The late medieval period also saw the transformation of governance and administration. Taxation systems became more sophisticated, legal codes were standardized, and bureaucracies emerged to manage the growing complexities of centralized rule. Urban centers gained importance as hubs of commerce, law, and civic life, further shifting power away from rural feudal lords. These developments, though gradual, laid the foundations for the modern state, where authority was increasingly concentrated in the hands of monarchs and their appointed officials. By the end of this era, Europe had moved decisively towards centralized political structures. The 100 Years' War and similar conflicts illustrated the limitations of feudal decentralization and underscored the necessity of strong, coherent monarchies. Monarchs like Edward III and Philip IV demonstrated that ambition, strategic vision, and political acumen could reshape the landscape of power. Meanwhile, human experiences, loyalty and betrayal, suffering and heroism, devastation and resilience, defined the lived reality of these transformations. The birth of nation-states was not instantaneous but evolutionary, forged through centuries of war, diplomacy, and social change. Declining feudal authority, coupled with emerging centralized monarchies and nascent national identities, set the stage for the profound cultural, intellectual, and political developments of the Renaissance. Europe had endured crisis after crisis, yet from the turmoil emerged stronger, more unified polities capable of projecting influence and fostering innovation. The late medieval era thus represents a pivotal turning point, where the interplay of human ambition, military innovation, and societal change paved the way for the modern age. 1,000 years of medieval Europe stretch across our imagination like a vast, tumultuous tapestry, woven from threads of ambition, faith, conflict, and survival. From the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the emergence of centralized monarchies, the continent endured cycles of consolidation and chaos, prosperity and catastrophe. Kings rose and fell, armies marched and clashed, and peasants toiled under burdens that would test the resilience of generations. Yet through famine, plague, and war, Europe survived. And in doing so, it laid the foundations for the world that would emerge in the Renaissance and beyond. The story of medieval Europe is one of contrasts. Early centuries were defined by fragility, fragmented kingdoms, feudal hierarchies, and the ever-present threat of invasion. Yet even in apparent disorder, communities adapted. Lords negotiated with local populations, monasteries preserved knowledge, and trade slowly revived. Over time, ambitious rulers such as Charlemagne sought to unify territories, strengthen central authority, and impose order, even as regional lords and independent vassals tested the limits of their power. Human drama, in the form of loyalty, betrayal, and ambition, infused every level of society. No victory or failure was merely political. It reverberated through the lives of millions, shaping social structures and cultural norms. The high medieval period intensified these dynamics. The Crusades exemplify the collision of faith and ambition, where spiritual ideals inspired armies even as human ambition dictated strategy, negotiation, and sometimes betrayal. Figures like Richard the Lionheart and Eleanor of Aquitaine navigated courts, battlefields, and alliances, leaving legacies intertwined with both glory and human frailty. Trade, cultural exchange, and intellectual curiosity were accelerated by these endeavors, revealing that conquest and commerce were rarely separate. Cities grew, ideas traveled, and new social classes emerged, demonstrating that even amid bloodshed, the seeds of progress took root. Yet the late medieval centuries tested the resilience of Europe like never before. The Black Death decimated populations, while peasant revolts and shifting labor dynamics challenged the authority of feudal lords. Warfare continued to ravage the landscape, with the 100 Years' War illustrating both the brutality of protracted conflict and the emergence of national identities. In these crises, the contours of European society shifted dramatically. Scarce labor empowered commoners, while centralized monarchies strengthened, redefining power and governance. Contrast is everywhere. Catastrophe birthed opportunity, despair inspired adaptation, and the human spirit endured in the face of overwhelming adversity. These transformations were not purely structural. They were deeply human. People lived, suffered, and hoped amid circumstances beyond their control. Loyalty and ambition intertwined, often clashing with morality or survival. The church attempted to guide and console, yet even faith was tested by mortality and corruption. Across villages, towns, and courts, ordinary and extraordinary lives intersected, shaping culture, governance, and identity. The echoes of these decisions, struggles, and alliances would resonate for centuries, influencing law, social norms, and the trajectory of European civilization. By the close of the Middle Ages, Europe had been profoundly reshaped. The rigid hierarchies of feudalism weakened, centralized states emerged, and cultural exchange flourished, setting the stage for the intellectual and artistic flowering of the Renaissance. The continent that once teetered on the edge of chaos had endured, adapted, and evolved. Monarchs, merchants, scholars, and peasants had all played a part, their lives entwined in the larger narrative of survival and transformation. History had demonstrated that catastrophe could accelerate progress, and that resilience, both individual and collective, was as essential to civilization as conquest or faith. In reflecting on these 1,000 years, one sees not only the calamities but the creativity and adaptability of humanity. Europe was not merely a land of castles, kings, and crusades. It was a laboratory of social, political, and economic experimentation. It was a world in which failure could devastate a population, yet innovation could lift it anew. From Charlemagne's courts to the battlefields of the 100 Years' War, from villages ravaged by plague to towns humming with trade, the medieval era illustrates the complex interplay between human ambition, societal structure, and uncontrollable forces. The legacy of medieval Europe endures because it demonstrates the delicate balance between chaos and order, suffering and opportunity, ambition and resilience. The lessons of these centuries are clear. Societies are shaped as much by crises as by triumphs, and human ingenuity and determination can transform even the harshest circumstances into catalysts for progress. The echoes of medieval kings, warriors, peasants, and clergy reverberate into our modern world, reminding us that the story of civilization is rarely linear, but always shaped by the choices, struggles, and endurance of those who lived it. In the end, medieval Europe is not simply a period to be studied, it is a story to be experienced. It is a testament to the human capacity to survive, adapt, and build amid uncertainty, to create order from disorder, and to leave a legacy that stretches far beyond its own age. As we look back on these 1,000 years of kings, plagues, and wars, we are reminded that history is a mirror, reflecting both the fragility and the extraordinary resilience of human society.